All right. Hey, thanks for tuning in, you guys. Go ahead and like and subscribe for more videos. Today we're talking Angel of Discord's top 50 favorite songs from the 1970s. So let's get to the playlist here on Spotify, which you can also find on my artist page on Spotify. Angel of Discord's top 50 songs from the 1970s. Jimi Hendrix kicks off the list with Like a Rolling Stone, because how much more 70s and good 70s does it get than Jimi Hendrix covering Bob Dylan? Even though it's live at Monterey, where Jimi Hendrix famously lit his guitar on fire, and so many things that were so flashy, I feel like this version of this song got overlooked. So for me, Like a Rolling Stone was a great example of Jimi basing his image, basing everything, and saying that he wanted to be Bob Dylan. That's pretty amazing, because he went out and he was Jimi Hendrix, you know? It's hard to parallel the two. So it's really cool to see cross-genre inspiration like that. Next on the list, speaking of which, is Bob Dylan. Isis is one of my favorite story songs. Ever since I was a kid, I'd listen to Isis while I fell asleep, because it tells such a beautiful story. And everybody has a different Bob Dylan favorite song, but Desire and Blood on the Tracks are two of my favorite albums of all time. And my mom would play that track when I was like 5 and I was playing with my toys. In the background, there would be Bob Dylan's Desire playing. Alongside Transformer by Lou Reed, my mom would listen to that while I was playing too. She'd be in the kitchen cooking, listening to some music while I'd be playing with toys, hearing all these stories and all these artists. Satellite of Love is, for me, one of the best songs of the 70s, just because of the unique orchestration and progression. The sort of thing that makes you realize how Lou Reed and Frank Zappa were actually paralleled and compared to each other, and even kind of argued and fought with each other over who was the more of an artist and who was more invested in the music. And once you start listening to the two, you can see how they would be comparable and how they both had the same sort of vision. The Beatles, Across the Universe. This is the Beatles at the end of their career, the 1970s. In fact, I think their career ended very close to 1970. So it was a lot easier than you'd think to narrow it down, because you really just have the Let It Be album. It was still difficult, because even within the Let It Be album, you have many, many, many great songs, including Let It Be. But for me, Across the Universe has always put me in a special kind of transformative state. And honestly, if I was going to be really nitpicky and hipstery here, I would say instead of Across the Universe off of Let It Be Remastered, I would listen to Let It Be Naked, if you're interested. That is before, just really raw cuts, unmixed, so you can hear what they sounded like without any editing. And to me, that's where the Beatles really stood out, because artists today would not release something like that. And Let It Be was an album that many people argue was overproduced. So Let It Be Naked was fantastic, because it allows you to hear that whole album in a more traditional Beatles sense. Scatterbrain by Jeff Beck is next on the list. Now, as much as I want to put Scatterbrain at number 1, I had to put those other artists first because of significance. But for me personally, Jeff Beck is the greatest guitar player of all time, and Scatterbrain is one of his greatest performances. It is some cool jazz fusion, and if you haven't listened to the entirety of Blow by Blow, or if you've only listened to what he does with Rod Stewart, throw that shit in the trash. This is an amazing instrumental album with Stevie Wonder and other great artists that just play at the peak of their careers, and it inspired the shit out of Led Zeppelin. Enough said, right? Followed by Watermelon and Easter Hay. Beautiful conclusion to the strange ballad that is Joe's Garage, as the character goes insane and listens to one last rock opera within his mind. And it is so beautiful and heartwarming and touching, which was the thing that was amazing about Zappa, right? He could make these funny songs that still somehow hit you in this really sentimental and beautiful artistic way. When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin. My God, was the 70s a powerhouse, huh? Has that drum track, right? I think it's the most sampled drum beat of all time. John Bonham recorded it in a stairwell to get that echo. And that was all Jimmy Page's idea, because he was a visionary. Jimmy Page, much like Zappa, produced a lot of his own music and mixed and mastered it. So he had ideas like that he could actually follow through with, which I think is really cool. Especially back then when you're working with tape. That was a whole art form in and of its own. It's not like digital today. God Save the Queen, one of my favorite bands, the Sex Pistols, mostly because of lore and history and controversy and Johnny Rotten. What a character. And God Save the Queen showcases Johnny Rotten's God Save the Queen. Not to mention what would later become Green Day and Nirvana guitar styles and attitude really started to burgeon through, all because of such a strange coincidence that this band ever even happened. It's pretty cool. And now a total change of mood, which I think totally describes the 70s, right? Let's have a change of mood, a change of genre. Sentimental Lady by Fleetwood Mac. And yes, my favorite Fleetwood Mac song is Not Off Rumors, which is wild. This song, you wouldn't even think it is Fleetwood Mac because the guy who wrote it left Fleetwood Mac shortly after to follow a solo career because he thought he was the only talent. And that's when they blew up, because that's when Stevie Nicks came in, which is so funny to me. The cruel irony. Sadly, the guy who wrote Sentimental Lady did kill himself many years later. And I think one of the reasons why may have been that decision, but it may have also been because, as you can hear in Sentimental Lady, he struggled with some serious, serious depression. And it's a beautiful articulation of that. Again, the 70s, just so hard to judge what the best songs are when these genres, there were so many different sounds coming out, and it's hard to say one was better than another because they were all so different and also interconnected. But Jolene by Dolly Parton is such a beautiful melody. 9 to 5 is also good, but I chose Jolene because it's iconic. Don't Fear the Reaper. Now we're looking at one of my favorite, most underrated bands that had quite a few bangers, Blue Oyster Cult. And at that time, they were known as a really druggy, really edgy band. Got Patti Smith breaking through with some of that poetry, some of that real punk rock. She was a woman, but she dressed like a man, she talked like a man, and she did what she wanted like a man in a way that Joan Jett later would do. And Patti Smith did it in the most arty way maybe any punk has ever been. I'm inspired by James Taylor. I think he's great. I think that he can write a really touching, sentimental song. If I'm being honest, though, this might be my favorite, and maybe the only one that I would put on repeat. Now, I wasn't a Bowie fan until I heard Low. Until I heard Low, I'd kind of written him off. I'd kind of been like, he was bad, Beatles-inspired pop psychedelia, and it was cheesy, and it was too of the times, and almost too sold out. But when I heard Low, I was like, am I tripping? Is this David Bowie, this fusion masterpiece? That's when I realized that he worked his ass off, and he was so much more than his big hits. One-hit wonders, Mungo Jerry, In the Summertime, had to make the list. Is it too high up? Maybe. It's still there. It's great. Iggy Pop kind of transcended his usual sound here and the Stooges and wrote something really remarkably Lou Reed inspired, and that was The Passenger. Leonard Cohen in the 70s was, like I said in my previous 60s video, I think his career was one of those rare ones, same with Jeff Beck, that went uphill. he kept doing better. It never hit that low that most artists do. I think Leonard Cohen just kept getting better with time. And the 70s for me is a better era than the 60s. The 2000s better than the 70s. The 2010s maybe his peak. It's because he's a poet and that life experience doesn't hurt. Is This What You Wanted is a great breakup song. And I like Leonard Cohen breaking his normal cool and actually sounding possibly insane. It's very entertaining and a little punk. Speaking of poetic, Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb is the next on the list. It's so hard to rate these artists back to back because every time you read one, you say, oh, is that too low? And then you look at the list and you say, no, it's fair. Because there were that many great bands coming out and that many iconic classic songs. If the Boomers contributed one thing that was really above all else, global warming, whatever, they had great bands. Speaking of more poetic and yet beautifully articulate and jazz fusion-oriented music that's coming out in a pop format, we've got Dire Straits with the Sultans of Swing. Keeping in line, we've got Tiny Dancer, Elton John. Maybe one of the catchiest melodies of all time. Can you believe Elton John didn't think he should sing when they started the band? I was mind blown when I realized that Van Halen happened in the 1970s. I always thought he was in the 80s. Now that I realize what he was playing alongside, you can realize why Finger Taps blew everyone's mind. Ice Cream Man to me has one of the best solos, and I like hearing Van Halen do classic blues, but you can really listen to the whole first album and hear how revolutionary it was paired up with these other 70s albums. It was a big step in terms of guitar proficiency. Hey, for better or worse, right? Less Than Zero. Elvis Costello is one of my favorite punks because he's got all the snarkiness, but he's got a lot more sensitivity as well as wit. My parents don't think that I respect nothing, but everything means less than zero. I mean, that one takes you a minute to get, and then you say, oh, wow, that's pretty fucking snarky. That's as snarky as John Lydon, but maybe a little bit more witty. But watch him dance. Sky is a band I didn't know until I worked with the bass player at Crown of the Continent, who later on now is touring with Eric Clapton as a bass player, famously written some Daft Punk bass lines, including Get Lucky. These first albums, I think Sky 2 is the preferable one, but they're both very good instrumental fusion jazz. And Hata was the pick. Boston's interesting. I did not like them for a long time, and I lumped them with Journey. But again, like Van Halen, I didn't realize they came out in the 70s. And one thing that I never had heard, one guy on that first album with Foreplay Long Time, one guy played all the instruments. And back then, you're recording with tape. You're having to turn on the record and then go down. Apparently, you recorded it in a basement. That's a lot of talent. That's hard to pass. Peter Frampton wrote his two biggest hits, one of them being the next pick, Show Me the Way, on a beach in one day, that he says is the best day of his life. Okay, so it's hard to pick a Rolling Stones song from the 70s, right? But I just went with their snarkiest, Star Star. Could be called Starfucker, but at the time, I don't know if they would have gotten away with it. And it's actually a good song, considering that it was made because the record company wanted them to add another song to Goat's Head Soup, because they didn't think it was good enough. So they added one that they thought would just piss off the record company. Ooh, Black Sabbath was a powerhouse in the 70s. I could have put Paranoid. I could have put Iron Man. If I wanted to be cheesy, War Pigs. Iron Man is one of the first songs I ever learned to play. We did it in a cover band in 6th grade, and I played the drums so loud you couldn't hear anything else. Children of the Grave was my pick, though. I always remember it with Jack Black in that one video game, that Xbox game, and you're riding in the car, and Children of the Grave, it just was a powerful experience. I remember Jasmine Poncelet sent me Maggot Brain. friends as musicians, you know, and she was a great guitar player. And she sent me Maggot Brain and just said, listen to this. And I saw that it was 10 minutes. I was like, hell no, I'm not listening to that. But I sent her one. Years later, I went back and we were having a conversation. So I went back and I was like, oh, fuck it. Let's listen. Holy shit. Greatest guitar solo of all time without technicality even. Just pure soul. I have that Tom Petty anthology. And I gotta say, I remember driving to UNLV and one of my best friends, Graham Hutchins, had told me, you know what? Tom Petty's one of his top 10 favorite artists, and I was laughing at him. But I decided, okay, I'll get the anthology. We'll give it a shot. Driving to Las Vegas for the first time, going to UNLV for college, listened to the entire thing twice. And I was blown away. It's so poppy. It's so catchy. Any song you pick off that anthology, gold. Crazy Love. This is another artist that I discovered by playing at Crown of the Continent and getting to have a scholarship there and getting to actually learn from these artists. And this guy was so cool. I got to ride horses with him and his wife. And honestly, I was pretty blown away by how chill Jim Messina was. And it made me listen to Poco more. But when the time came that they did their sound check, they played this song live and a cappella for the sound check. They had instruments during the real performance, but during the sound check, I was like, whoa, what is that? It's a very good song. It's a marvelous night for a moon dance. What more do I need to say? Van Morrison? You gotta pick one from the 70s, and you know which one you'll pick. It's not Brown Eyed Girl. Bob Marley. Oh, I had his entire anthology too. It was given to me by my flamenco guitar teacher. Really weird. He's like, I heard you like the blues. And so he gave me Bob Marley. And I was like, okay. You know, maybe once you're that into folk art and other countries' music, then it all sounds the same to you. But I was kind of like, this is reggae. But I listened to all of it. It was all the B-sides and all the stuff. And I realized he's a powerhouse pop writer. It's really hard to choose, but I like that C, G, A minor, F progression in No Woman, No Cry. And the guitar solo in a live version on YouTube is really good. AC/DC. This was one of my favorite bands since I was a kid. I think it was my first favorite band when I was in middle school and I was learning to play the drums because it was so simple. I could just drum right along and start to get my chops. And AC/DC will always be the foreground of simple, good rock and roll. And yeah, a lot of people get evolved past that and they get mad and bitter. But I love AC/DC. I think they're so easy to just put on in a bar setting and have everybody in a good mood. Speaking of bands that get a lot of guff and a lot of hate, because they were up against some of the greatest bands of all time in the 70s, Kiss. Kiss may be the best marketed band of all time. And admittedly, a lot of their records are pretty bad. The first two, I think, stand the test of time. She is a banger. You can even hear the Sword cover it. They're sick. I think I went back and forth with Queen between Killer Queen or Fat Bottom Girls. Bohemian Rhapsody, maybe. And I ended up on Fat Bottom Girls just because that song is fun. And it's fun to hear Freddie Mercury and also, the fucking neurosurgeon or whatever, that astrophysicist, guitar player, fucking both of them shredding, having a good time. It sounds like they're having fun. Along with AC/DC, along with Kiss, what's the trifecta of 70s bands people love to hate? Grateful Dead. There's your trifecta. 5-6 good songs, that's a good band. Grateful Dead has probably more than that. And yeah, maybe some of it's a little droney or you have to be a fan. But you can always put on Casey Jones or Uncle John's Band, Alabama Getaway, Dire Wolf. And for me, Uncle John's Band is one of the biggest bangers of chill rock that there's ever been. Heart, Crazy on You. Heart's another band where it's so hard because they have so many top tier songs. But Crazy on You for me has always been a favorite, along with Heartbreaker, Barracuda, Those vocals, though. Live, my God, she can sing. Welcome to my nightmare, Alice Cooper. I just want Alice Cooper to be on the list, and I like him up on the top. Welcome to my nightmare deserves it, but I'll admit, he's an artist that's hit or miss. Give Welcome to My Nightmare a chance, because it's very good. Not only just because of theatrics, but also because of weird hell jazz. It's great. Love Her Madly by The Doors. That's the next on the list. You can just choose a song off of LA Woman, put it on shuffle. This was the end of The Doors, you know? 1967 was a good year for them. 1970 was getting rough. Jim was a little off the rails, but he still put out a few good songs on that record. Train in Vain by The Clash. It's a hard one to deny. What a drum beat. What a bass line. It's not even like what you'd expect to be a banging bass line, but it is. And it's just one of those songs where you're like, what? This is good. Oh my God, I just get excited looking at these bands. You just get this rush of like, what? That all came out around the same year? That's crazy. But the Allman Brothers, Ramblin' Man. Narrowing down Allman Brothers songs hard with Dwayne fucking shredding in the 70s. But Ramblin' Man's solo is one of my favorites of all time. That solo has like 5 parts. Every time you're like, wow, it's reached its peak and I'm happy, they hit you with another one. And every time you're like, oh man, I don't know, like how can he top the last one? He does. It flows so well and so far beyond what it needed. We didn't need that good of a solo from Dwayne, but he did it for us. Mississippi Queen by Mountain. This Leslie West is Jimi Hendrix's favorite guitar player from the 70s. Enough said. Ooh, maybe a little low on the list, we've got Aerosmith with Back in the Saddle. Slash said it best. They didn't get credit for rocks being grunge in the 70s before grunge. Because that's what happened. Even Kurt Cobain will admit that. He was a huge Aerosmith fan, super influenced by that album. That's the grunge movement. Listen to Rocks. There's no hits on it, but it's fucking grunge. Now, I thought Janis Joplin made Me and Bobby McGee in the 60s, but it was the 70s. Freedom is just another word for Nothing Left to Lose. This just shows how a song can get carried to be profound by one line. That's one line, but it's one of the best lyrics of all time, and it carries the song. Up to my top favorite songs from that whole era, just because of one line. It was practically a cult. It was Talking Heads. With the giant suit, he would spend all his time. People would try to talk to him before his shows or after his shows, and he'd be sitting and writing more lyrics. And he had so much weird, kind of almost voodoo-like wisdom. Speaking of one line, now we've got one riff. ZZ Top just got paid. It's just so good and bluesy and weirdly rhythmically strange in a way that keeps you hooked, even though it's so simple. The first song to ever get on alternative college rock radio, Frankenstein by Edgar Winter Group. Giant 6'4", 6'5", fucking albino, long hair hippie, effeminate man. I mean, this guy was a character. He got wasted one night. He destroyed the whole studio. He ripped up all the tape. When he woke up in the morning, they had to Frankenstein it back together in the wrong order. So they called it Frankenstein. Ended up being the first song that ever got famous just off of college radio plays, because it was so psychedelic. We're getting to the end of the list. We've got the Buzzcocks with Orgasm Addict. You know, they were the knockoff Sex Pistols, but they were good at it. And I like that song. It's funny. The Temple of the King. This is an interesting song because it's got Dio, who would later sing with not only Black Sabbath in the 80s, but then his own solo band, Dio. And he was already in the Electric Elves or something weird. But it also had Richie Blackmore, who was in Deep Purple. So it was a weird supergroup with only 2 good songs, I think, Man on the Mountain and Temple of the King, which I think is beautiful. Beautiful acoustic guitar work, and Dio does fine. The melody's amazing. And last but not least, The Damned with New Rose. I got a new rose, I got a good. Another song that was covered a little bit, but pretty unknown, and I think pretty cool, from the 70s punk rock era. So that sums up my favorite songs from the 1970s. Thanks for tuning in. Rock on.